She needs me more than I need her. Rachel overheard that sentence completely by accident. She did not enter the living room. Instead, she turned around, walked quietly back into the kitchen, sat down, and stared at a plain white envelope resting on the wooden dining table. It was an envelope she knew the exact contents of, because she was the one who had placed it there just moments before. But before revealing what was sealed inside that crisp paper, it is necessary to go back to the beginning, because absolutely nothing that occurred on that rainy Portland afternoon was sudden. It took 23 years of slow, quiet erosion to reach that exact moment. Everything began at a loud, dimly lit brewery in downtown Portland, Oregon, with a raised glass of pale ale and a phrase that he had been repeating to his friends for years. Matthew smiled confidently, leaned back in his leather chair, and brought the cold glass to his lips. "Rachel will never leave me." The men around the table chuckled, wiping foam from their mouths. "How can you be so incredibly sure of that?" Matthew merely shrugged his shoulders. He did it with the casual certainty of someone discussing the sun rising in the east, simply stating, "Because she needs me." She might complain, she might create a little drama, but actually pack up and walk away? Never. After all, it had been 23 years that Rachel had been standing right by his side. 23 years of waking up in the damp, foggy Oregon mornings, taking care of their suburban home, anticipating his needs, and solving complex domestic problems he never even realized existed, always choosing to stay. What Matthew did not know, and could not possibly fathom in his comfortable ignorance, was that on that very same evening she was sitting in their dimly lit kitchen, looking at an envelope. It was just a simple white envelope, yet it possessed the immense power to completely obliterate every single one of his arrogant certainties, because inside that envelope were the fully drafted divorce papers. And for the absolute first time in over 2 decades, Rachel was no longer agonizing over how to save their crumbling marriage. She was deeply, intently thinking about how to finally save herself. What Matthew still fundamentally failed to understand was that a woman rarely walks away out of the blue. First, she tries to fix things, then she insists on being heard, then she quietly endures, then she waits, and when she finally falls entirely silent, she has often already left on the inside. Rachel no longer needed him. To truly comprehend what led Rachel to place that envelope on the table, one must travel back a few years. Not to the joyful genesis of their marriage, not to when the Pacific Northwest skies seemed endlessly bright and full of romantic promise, but to the exact period when things began to subtly shift. It happened in a manner so silent, so profoundly gradual, that she barely registered the loss of her own voice. Rachel was 51 years old, a woman with warm, dark hair elegantly woven with natural silver threads that she no longer bothered to dye or hide. She was a dedicated mathematics teacher at a bustling public middle school in Portland. Her daily routine was a masterclass in relentless exhaustion. She woke up at 5:30 in the morning, brewed the coffee, packed the lunches, and prepared dinner well in advance. She would arrive back at their home at 6 in the evening, immediately wash the laundry, sort through the towering pile of utility bills, help their daughter with whatever was needed, and still find the energy to turn to her husband and softly ask, "Do you want me to heat up dinner for you now?" His response was predictably identical every single day. A distracted grunt, a dismissive wave of his hand without breaking eye contact with his glowing screen. She heated the food anyway, placing it gently in front of him. Matthew was a successful civil engineer, 54 years old, holding a senior position at a prestigious firm, a man who believed his life was perfectly in order. He was not an inherently evil man, at least not the type who threw plates or raised his voice in terrifying anger. Matthew's cruelty was infinitely more subtle and insidious. He was the kind of husband who supposedly listened to her speak, while his eyes remained glued to his smartphone. He was the husband who would sigh patronizingly and say, "Rachel, you just do not understand how the real world works." He was the man who constantly recounted grand stories at dinner parties, where he was always the triumphant hero, and she was entirely absent from the narrative, treated as though she were merely the interchangeable background scenery of his magnificent life. For the longest time, she simply accepted this reality. At first, she thought it was a flaw within her own personality. Perhaps she was being too sensitive. Later, she accepted it because she was genuinely too utterly exhausted from her long days of teaching to initiate a battle. Eventually, she accepted it out of fear. It was not a fear of physical violence, but a profound dread of the vast unknown. The terrifying questions kept her awake. What if I end up completely alone? What if absolutely nobody else will ever want me? What if I am making a catastrophic mistake? This specific type of emotional paralysis has a distinct name, but back then, Rachel had not yet learned what it was. She just kept grading her students' algebra papers, making sure the house was spotless, and swallowing the heavy, suffocating lump of invisibility that sat permanently in her throat, convincing herself that this quiet suffering was just what long-term commitment looked like in the United States of America. The first distinct moment Rachel felt something fundamentally shatter inside her chest happened on a rainy Friday night in late autumn. She had spent the entire week meticulously organizing a beautiful celebration for their wedding anniversary. 20 years together. There were only 3 years left until they would reach the present day of the envelope, but back then, she was still desperately trying. She had reserved a table at a tiny, intimate, candlelit seafood restaurant in the Pearl District, the exact same place they had dined during their honeymoon, before driving down the Oregon coast. For the first time in 2 long years, she had purchased a brand new dress, a deep navy blue that complemented her eyes. She had arranged for their young grandchildren to stay overnight at their daughter's house, ensuring the evening would be perfectly uninterrupted. Everything was set. At exactly 8 o'clock at night, as she stood fully ready in the living room, nervously smoothing the fabric of her new dress, his phone violently vibrated against the mahogany coffee table. It was a message from his engineering firm. He read it, rapidly typed out a response, and then looked up at her, with that practiced expression of someone about to deliver bad news as if it were the most mundane thing in the world. Rachel, a massive structural issue just popped up at the new downtown site. I am going to have to go in. She stood frozen, staring at him. She was wearing her beautiful new dress, carrying 20 years of shared history and sacrifices heavily in her heart. Not tonight, Matthew, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He sighed loudly, rolling his eyes just a fraction. It is my job, Rachel. You understand how important this is, right? But she did not understand. She absolutely did not understand how a concrete foundation was more vital than the foundation of their life together. Numbly, she decided to take an Uber to the restaurant anyway, completely alone. She sat down at the small table clearly reserved for 2. When the dessert course arrived, the sympathetic waiter brought out a slice of chocolate cake with a single glowing candle. She blew it out in total solitude, quietly asked for the check, and tipped the waiter generously. On the long taxi ride back to their suburban home, leaning her head against the cold, rain-streaked window, she wept in a profoundly different way than she had in years. It was not a violent weeping of sudden anger. It was the deep, bone-aching sobbing of utter exhaustion, the kind of soul-crushing fatigue that a good night of sleep can never cure. Yet, despite the pain, she still did not fully realize what monumental changes were looming on the horizon. The months that strictly followed were characterized by a suffocating silence. It was not the comfortable, golden silence of a deeply connected couple who profoundly understand each other without needing to utter a single word. It was the barren, echoing silence of 2 strangers who merely happened to sleep on opposite edges of the very same mattress, inhabiting entirely different universes. Rachel began to hyper-focus on the tragic little details she had previously conditioned herself to ignore. She noticed that he never actually asked how her day was, not with any genuine curiosity. His casual "how are you" was an automated bodily reflex, exactly like saying goodbye. He never paused long enough to actually hear her answer. She also acutely noticed that whenever she fell physically ill, he became visibly annoyed and impatient, acting as if her failing health was a deliberate inconvenience specifically designed to ruin his day. There was one particularly brutal winter week when she contracted a severe strain of the flu. She ran a blazing fever of 38.5 degrees and could barely muster the strength to lift her head off the soaked pillows. During those agonizing days, Matthew walked into their bedroom exactly one time. A single, solitary visit. He stood in the doorway, keeping a safe distance, and flatly asked if there was anything prepared for dinner. Rachel, shivering violently under 3 heavy blankets, managed to croak out that there was some leftover chicken and rice stored in the refrigerator. He walked to the kitchen, microwaved the food, but only enough for himself, and immediately returned to the living room to watch his sports channel. She was left entirely alone in the dark bedroom, battling the soaring fever with nothing but a glass of tepid water. That cruel negligence was not an isolated exception. It was the absolute governing rule of their entire marriage. However, there was a pivotal catalyst waiting in the wings, and once she encountered it, there was no turning back. It was actually their daughter who truly noticed the shifting tides first. Chloe was 26 years old, a vibrant young woman living in a trendy neighborhood across the river with her long-term boyfriend. She made it a strict point to visit her mother every single Sunday. On this particular, cloudy Sunday afternoon, Chloe arrived a little earlier than usual. She knocked on the front door, Rachel opened it, and Chloe instantly noticed that her mother's eyes were bloodshot and swollen, carrying heavy dark bags of unspoken grief. Chloe did not press the issue the very second she walked through the door. She wisely waited until they had finished eating their roasted chicken lunch. She waited until her father excused himself and retreated to the garage to tinker with his vintage car, exactly as he predictably did every weekend. Only when the house fell quiet did Chloe reach across the dining table, firmly gently grab her mother's trembling hand, and ask in a soft, piercing tone, "Mom, what is actually going on with you?" Rachel hesitated for a long time. She turned her gaze to the large bay window, staring out at the lush, blooming garden she painstakingly maintained with her own 2 hands. It was stunningly beautiful, overflowing with vibrant Oregon flora, yet Matthew had never once complimented it. "Nothing, my sweet girl. I am perfectly fine," Rachel lied, attempting a fragile smile. But Chloe's grip only tightened. "No, you are not fine. I know you better than anyone." And it was exactly at that moment that Rachel's dam finally broke. She began to speak slowly at first, carefully choosing her words like someone cautiously removing sharp, jagged rocks from a long blocked path. She spoke about the ruined anniversary dinner, the crushing daily silence, the agonizing physical exhaustion, and the devastating reality of feeling completely invisible inside the very home she built. When Rachel finally stopped talking, Chloe's bright eyes were welling with heavy tears. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" Chloe asked, her voice cracking. "Because I was deeply ashamed, Chloe." "Ashamed of what?" "Ashamed that I stayed for so incredibly long without even realizing what was happening to me." It was Chloe who, just a few weeks later, sent her mother a video link in a text message. It was a long lecture by a renowned American clinical psychologist discussing emotionally neglectful relationships. The expert spoke extensively about partners who do not necessarily abuse with raised fists or screamed insults, but who slowly erase you. Partners who aggressively ignore, belittle, and systematically make the other person feel that they are never enough, that their thoughts are trivial, and that they do not deserve basic human attention. Rachel locked herself in the bathroom and watched the entire video 3 consecutive times. Afterward, she sat fully clothed on the edge of the bathtub, staring blankly at the white ceiling for a very long time. Every single word the psychologist articulated perfectly described Rachel's daily existence, sentence by sentence, painful scenario by painful scenario. It felt as though an invisible biographer had written a shockingly accurate documentary about her private life without ever having met her. That profound video was not the definitive end of her suffering, but rather the crucial beginning of her awakening. Rachel immediately started to read psychology books, search for online forums, and actively try to understand her own mind. And the more knowledge she absorbed, the more horrifyingly clear became just how much of her core identity she had surrendered over those 2 decades. She realized she had completely stopped painting beautiful watercolor landscapes Because many years ago, Matthew had glanced at one of her finished canvases and coldly remarked that he simply did not understand how anyone could consider such messy blobs to be actual art. She had completely stopped organizing weekend brunches with her female colleagues because, although he never explicitly forbade it, he would pout and make the atmosphere so incredibly heavy and hostile upon her return that she eventually decided it was just easier to avoid going out altogether. She had even stopped dreaming of taking a grand romantic vacation to the cobblestone streets of Portugal because every single time she excitedly brought up the travel brochures, he would immediately change the subject to the rising costs of roof repairs. She had shrunk herself down to a microscopic version of a human being, slowly, deliberately, without ever noticing, and tragically, she had convinced herself that this slow suffocation was completely normal. But the final discovery that truly, irrevocably altered the trajectory of her life did not come from a textbook, nor did it come from a supportive YouTube video. It arrived on a totally ordinary Wednesday afternoon. She had managed to leave the middle school a bit earlier than usual after finishing her grading. When she stepped onto the front porch, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. She could distinctly hear his booming voice echoing from the home office. It sounded remarkably different. It was surprisingly light, highly animated, and full of a relaxed joy. It was exactly the warm tone of voice she had not heard directed at her in years. She paused quietly in the carpeted hallway, holding her breath, and listened. Rachel will never pack up and leave. A brief, arrogant pause. She absolutely needs me way more than I need her. Rachel did not scream in outrage. She did not burst into tears. She just stood frozen in the hallway for a single second that stretched out and felt exactly like an hour. But miraculously, that deeply cruel sentence did not destroy her. It actually did the exact opposite. It jolted her wide awake like a splash of freezing water. She quietly walked straight to the kitchen, sat down on the wooden chair, and focused her mind on one singular thing. Not on his betrayal, but on herself. She thought about the vibrant woman she was before she signed that marriage license, what she truly desired for the remaining years of her life, and about a secret project she had naturally been cultivating for the past few months. Roughly 6 months prior to that fateful Wednesday afternoon, Rachel had initiated something small, almost completely by accident. A quiet, struggling 15-year-old student of hers named Lily was fundamentally failing algebra. Lily's mother was a single parent working double shifts at a local diner and absolutely could not afford to hire a private tutor. Seeing the quiet desperation in the girl's eyes, Rachel kindly offered to stay after the school bell rang to provide extra help entirely for free. 2 afternoons every week. Slowly but surely, the young girl's test scores dramatically improved. Word of this miraculous turnaround rapidly spread through the tight-knit community of parents. 3 struggling students quickly turned into 5. 5 eager students rapidly multiplied into 10. Eventually, a highly organized mother asked if Rachel would be willing to formally teach an advanced, remedial math class at a funded community social project in East Portland, offering her a very generous hourly compensation. Rachel nervously agreed, and then something entirely unexpected occurred. She realized she possessed a truly spectacular gift. Everyone who sat in her classroom profoundly felt it. She had a unique, brilliant way of breaking down complex fractions and equations, so they perfectly clicked in the students' minds, doing so with infinite patience, gentle care, and that rare, magnetic presence people only feel when someone is genuinely, entirely focused on their success. Within just a few short months, she was generating an amount of personal income she had never previously thought possible on a teacher's modest salary. It was not a massive, life-changing fortune, but it was absolutely sufficient. It was sufficient to secretly open a brand new bank account solely in her own name. It was completely sufficient to schedule a highly confidential consultation with a top-tier family law attorney in downtown Portland. Most importantly, it was entirely sufficient to make her firmly realize that she was more than capable of financially sustaining herself in the United States of America. But far beyond the crisp dollar bills, that part-time job returned a piece of her soul. It gave her back the intoxicating sensation of being undeniably excellent at something, of truly mattering to her community, of being clearly seen and deeply valued. When Rachel boldly walked into the polished glass office of her new lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah, she did not arrive empty-handed. She carried a thick, meticulously organized binder containing tax returns, utility bills, mortgage statements, and bank records. She did not look like a lost, shattered victim. She presented herself as a fully prepared, determined survivor. The experienced attorney looked across the desk at her with genuine surprise and immediate professional respect. Sarah leaned forward and said, "The vast majority of people walk into my office in a state of total emotional chaos, completely falling apart. You, however, walked in here completely ready for battle." Rachel smiled softly, adjusting her scarf, and replied, "It literally took me years of quiet suffering to finally reach this chair. I absolutely refuse to arrive doing this halfway." From that afternoon onward, the complex process of legally dissolving her marriage was meticulously sketched out. It was done with extreme calm, calculated strategy, absolutely zero haste, and surprisingly zero burning hatred. Rachel did not harbor a toxic desire to financially destroy Matthew, nor did she want to severely punish him for his emotional failures. She simply, rationally wanted her fair, equal half of the assets they had legally built together over the decades, and above all else, she desperately wanted her ultimate freedom. The tense weeks that directly preceded the day she finally left the signed paper on the kitchen table were characterized by a highly unusual, eerie tranquility. She flawlessly continued executing her typical daily chores. She woke up early, taught her classes, graded papers, and cooked his dinners. Yet there was an undeniable luminous shift in her aura, a distinct lightness in her physical movements that Matthew could not quite comprehend. One evening, while aggressively slicing a piece of steak at dinner, he suddenly stopped, looked at her curiously, and asked, "Did you go to the salon and cut your hair?" "No," she replied smoothly. He frowned slightly. "Then what exactly is it? You seem totally different lately." She simply offered a tiny, mysterious smile and softly said, "I am just doing very well." And that was the absolute, undeniable truth. She was doing exceedingly well. It was not the exhausting, performative happiness of someone desperately trying to convince themselves that they are. It was the raw, authentic peace of a woman who had firmly made a massive decision that permanently liberated her spirit. The entire night before she left, she lay wide awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. It was not due to crippling anxiety, but a state of hyper-awareness. She listened intently to the familiar sounds of the house settling, the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan, and the heavy, oblivious breathing of the man sleeping on the far side of the mattress. 23 years trapped inside that bedroom, yet she had honestly never felt so incredibly lucid and alive. She understood that some painful actions are absolutely necessary, even when they temporarily break your heart. She had endured the sharp pain of loneliness all by herself for far too long. It was finally time to permanently stop hurting over the love she was never going to receive and boldly begin building the beautiful life she inherently deserved. The very next morning, while Matthew was still deeply asleep, she quietly slid out of bed. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker, unzipped her leather bag, and smoothly pulled out the thick stack of legal papers. She folded the crisp white envelope perfectly in half, placed it dead center on the table where he could not possibly miss it, and waited. When he finally shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his tired eyes, he immediately spotted the envelope. He froze instantly in the doorway, his gaze completely locked onto the white rectangle, as if his engineering brain could simply not process its existence. "What exactly is this, Rachel?" he demanded, his voice thick with confusion and rising panic. She did not rush to answer him. She calmly picked up her warm ceramic mug, took a very slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee, and then softly replied, "You know exactly what it is, Matthew." He desperately expected her to violently break down crying. He foolishly expected her to dramatically beg for a lengthy conversation. He fully expected her to do exactly what she had always predictably done, surrender to his authority. But Rachel did absolutely none of those things. She smoothly stood up from the chair, casually grabbed her coat and purse, and confidently walked out the front door, leaving him standing barefoot in the kitchen, with a terrifying sensation he had never once felt in his entire life. The horrible realization that this time, things were permanently different, and he was completely powerless to stop it. Later that same morning, she drove to a charming artisanal bakery in the vibrant Pearl District to meet Chloe. They sat by a large glass window, sipping warm lattes. Chloe's beautiful eyes were brimming with unshed tears, but Rachel's posture was impossibly serene. "Mom, are you absolutely 100% sure about this?" Chloe asked, her hands shaking slightly around her cup. "I am," Rachel answered with total conviction. "And are you truly going to be okay?" Rachel reached across the small wooden table and firmly held her daughter's warm hand. "I am, Chloe. For the very first time in an incredibly long time, I am genuinely, wonderfully okay." What happened to Matthew over the course of the following weeks was a catastrophic unraveling he never saw coming. Initially, his colossal ego convinced him she was merely bluffing. He relied heavily on that deeply ingrained, arrogant certainty built over years that Rachel would never actually pack her bags, because she had always unconditionally compromised, always desperately preferred maintaining a fake peace over engaging in a real confrontation. He angrily called her phone later that very same night. Surprisingly, she answered on the third ring. "Rachel, we immediately need to sit down and talk about this," he demanded forcefully. "You can speak right now," she replied evenly. "No, I mean face to face. You need to drive back to the house right now." "No." A heavy, suffocating silence hung on the line. "Rachel, please," he stammered. "Matthew, my lawyer, Sarah, will be actively contacting your office sometime this week. Anything else that formally needs to be discussed can be communicated directly through her." And with that, she pressed the red button and hung up. He sat alone on their expensive leather sofa, staring blankly at his darkened phone screen, overwhelmed by an intensely alien emotion, the terrifying feeling of completely losing control. Desperate, he attempted several different tactics. He aggressively sent long text messages demanding they attend couples therapy. He sent pathetic messages claiming he missed her cooking. He even sent hollow promises swearing that his behavior would drastically change. One late night, fueled by a glass of whiskey, he typed, "You were absolutely the best thing that ever happened to my life." Rachel sat in her new temporary rental, staring at those glowing letters, thinking about the thousands of lonely nights she had desperately prayed to hear those exact words. Throughout all those freezing dinners, all those ignored illnesses, all those forgotten anniversaries, she did not reply out of a sense of vicious cruelty. She merely typed back a single, honest sentence. "You really should have said that when it still actually mattered to me." Panic setting in, he tried to manipulate Chloe. He called his daughter, hoping she would serve as his loyal spy. Chloe answered the call, but she absolutely did not provide the comforting sympathy he sought. Instead, she delivered a harsh dose of reality. "Dad, did you even know that Mom deliberately turned down a massive promotion at the school district back when you lost your engineering job just so she could be home to support you?" Total silence on his end. "Did you know she quietly paid for a huge chunk of my college textbooks without ever telling you, because you complained about the cost?" More silence. "Did you know she secretly sold her beautiful watercolor paintings online just to keep from bothering you for extra grocery money?" Absolute silence. "Did you know she literally saved loose change in a jar for years, desperately hoping to afford a trip to Portugal, a trip you bluntly told her was a stupid waste of money?" Chloe's young voice grew incredibly firm and icy. "You never even bothered to ask her, Dad. You just took her for granted." And then Chloe hung up on him too. Matthew was left completely alone in the massive, echoing suburban house, staring at his phone, feeling violently nauseous, as if he were suddenly reading the biography of a complete stranger. A generous, brilliant stranger who had slept quietly beside him for 23 years, who had fiercely protected him, who had silently sacrificed her own blazing potential just to keep him comfortable. And he had literally never once asked her what she dreamed about. Never. The intricate legal process of finalizing the divorce dragged on for several grueling months. It was certainly not without its share of deep emotional pain, nor was it without extremely difficult, tear-filled nights. There were quiet, rainy evenings when Rachel would accidentally stumble upon old, faded photo albums showing their early road trips or the joyful hospital pictures from the day Chloe was born, and she would feel a profound heavy ache deep inside her chest. However, it was crucially not an ache of regret. It was the painful process of active mourning. It was a funeral for the phantom version of the life she had once foolishly believed they were building together. But grieving a profound loss is fundamentally different from doubting a correct decision. She would sit on her couch, cry until her eyes burned, and then firmly wipe her face and continue moving forward. She would feel a wave of intense sadness wash over her, let it pass, and continue moving forward. She occasionally missed tiny fleeting moments of that old life, but there was a massive, distinct boundary between feeling nostalgic for a brief memory and actually wanting to return to the burning building. She allowed herself to feel the sorrow without ever once considering walking backward into the cage. Throughout these transformative months, her daily existence began to take on a vibrant, beautiful new shape. She successfully signed a lease for a charming, slightly cramped apartment in a lively Portland neighborhood. When she first received the keys, all the interior walls were painted a depressing, sterile white. She spent her first weekend passionately painting them. She painted the cozy living room a rich, earthy sage green, the quiet bedroom a warm, calming beige, and the small kitchen a bright, cheerful yellow. She enthusiastically hammered nails into the walls and hung up exactly what brought her joy. She framed and displayed her own long-forgotten watercolor landscapes, a beautiful candid photograph of Chloe laughing as a child, and a printed quote she had discovered online months prior. Care for yourself with the same intensity as if you were the single most important person in your entire life, because you actually are. She joyfully resumed her painting hobby. At first, she only painted on Sunday mornings, surrounded by the smell of fresh coffee and absolute silence. Then she started painting twice a week. Eventually, she painted whenever the creative spark ignited, without ever needing to ask for permission, without worrying if someone else thought her brushstrokes were a waste of time. She painted frantically beautifully, as if she were desperately pouring life back into her own veins, reclaiming the vibrant parts of her soul she had locked in a dark closet for over 2 decades. Right around this incredible period of rebirth, Matthew desperately attempted to call her for the 3rd time in a single week. She calmly watched the phone ring and deliberately did not answer. Not out of a sense of bitter revenge, but simply because there were absolutely no words left to exchange. He left a rambling, emotional voicemail. She listened to it once, permanently deleted it, picked up her wet brush, and went right back to painting a vibrant blue sky. Simultaneously, her math tutoring classes continued to expand exponentially. She carefully structured her weekly schedule in a highly efficient manner she had never previously been able to achieve. Precisely because the cozy apartment was entirely hers, the ticking clock was hers, and every single choice was undeniably hers. She cleverly transformed a bright corner of her sage green living room into a functional classroom, complete with a sturdy oak table, a large whiteboard, and neatly stacked rows of textbooks. She passionately developed her own highly unique, engaging method for teaching complex fractions to severely struggling youths, utilizing simple, brilliant, real-world examples that made the intimidating numbers accessible. One afternoon, a deeply grateful mother of a 12-year-old student quietly recorded a brief clip of Rachel enthusiastically teaching complex algebra concept. With Rachel's explicit blessing, the mother proudly posted the clip on a popular social media platform. The short video unexpectedly exploded in popularity. Parents from completely different states began flooding Rachel's inbox, desperately begging to know if she offered online tutoring sessions. It took Rachel several bewildering weeks to actually process the overwhelming demand. Cautiously, bravely, she purchased a good webcam and began expanding her services online. Matthew accidentally discovered her booming success through Chloe's social media page. He sat in his dark office, and watched a viral video of Rachel confidently standing in front of a whiteboard, brilliantly explaining complex equations to a camera. She was glowing, smiling radiantly, totally present and fiercely intelligent. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had never actually seen this magnificent version of her. A few days later, acting on a sudden, pathetic impulse, he slowly drove his expensive car past the bustling community center where she taught her in-person classes. He aggressively parked his car across the busy street. It was not a premeditated stalking mission. He just felt magnetically pulled there. Through the large, open glass window, he could clearly hear her voice carrying across the room. It was remarkably different. It was incredibly strong, yet bursting with a genuine lightness. He watched a struggling young boy eagerly shoot his hand into the air, a massive smile of comprehension breaking across his face. He watched Rachel beam back at the child, radiating pure purpose and undeniable power. Matthew sat frozen behind his steering wheel for an agonizing amount of time, grappling with one devastating realization. In 23 years of marriage, he had never once bothered to ask her what she truly wanted to do with her magnificent mind, and right across the street, the brilliant answer was beautifully unfolding entirely without him. The divorce proceedings ended with a final meeting, where Matthew, finally recognizing his mistakes, admitted that he had taken Rachel for granted and wrongly believed she needed him more than he needed her. Rachel calmly acknowledged that he now understood the truth, but reminded him that understanding could not repair the damage of the past. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Rachel had built a peaceful new life. She enjoyed her apartment, her art, her teaching career, long walks through Washington Park, and a growing friendship with her neighbor Valerie. One evening, she wrote a list of the things that now truly belonged to her, realizing that although reclaiming her life had required immense courage, it had given her freedom, peace, laughter, and a renewed sense of self-worth. Weeks later, during a parent-teacher conference, Rachel shared her experience with a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage, explaining that her strength came gradually as she realized how much of herself she had lost, and decided she wanted her true self back. She told the woman that feeling completely alone beside someone who refuses to see or value you is far worse than living alone, and that true peace comes from choosing yourself when the time is right. Reflecting on her journey, Rachel understood that time is life's most precious resource and should not be wasted on relationships that can no longer grow. She learned that lasting happiness begins when people stop waiting for others to recognize their worth and instead embrace their own value, courageously building a future defined by freedom, self-respect, and genuine joy.